Today we're going to continue in Chapter 9 with section 9.0, talking about circles. And today we're going to focus on this last objective. We're going to look at converting equations of circles from general form into standard form. And the most important thing that we need here is to remember how to complete the square. So we have to remember our steps for completing the square. So the first step for completing the square is we need to make a 1. If you remember, my hint for that is steak sauce. Make a 1. Second step is to move the c, just like Moses. Got to move the c. Next step is add half of b squared. So there's half of b in a square. So we have to add half of b squared to each side of the equation. And at that point, we have now made something a perfect square, so it is now factorable. So then we factor it, and in this case, we won't actually be solving, but we will be factoring. So let's take a look at how that works for the following. So here's the equation for a circle. What we want to do is we want to change this into standard form. We're then going to identify the center and radius, and then we're going to graph it. So to change this into standard form, we are going to complete the square. So first thing I'm going to do is I actually need to complete the square twice. I need to do it once for x and once for y. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to group my terms together. I'm going to put my x terms together. So I'll start with x squared minus 4x and then group my y terms together. Y squared plus 2y. And then I've got a plus 1 equals 0. Next step is to make a 1, but there's kind of like two different values for a here I'm worried about. I'm worried about the value here in front of x squared and the value in front of y squared. But you'll notice both of these are just one of them already. So that step is done. Next step is to move the c over, so I subtract 1 from each side to move that over. Now I'm going to leave myself some blanks here because my next step is to add half of b squared. So what I'm going to do is I actually have to do that twice. I have to do that once for x and once for y. Basically, my goal here is to make this a perfect square trinomial. And the way I do that is by I take half of this number and I square it. So half of negative 4 is -2. When you square -2, you get positive 4. So I add half of b squared. But I'm not just allowed to add anything I want to an equation unless I add the exact same thing to the other side to keep it balanced. And then I'm going to do that same thing for y. So basically I want this to be a perfect square, and the way I do that is I do half of b, so I do half of this number, half of 2 is 1, I square it and I get 1. But again, I'm not allowed to just add 1 to an equation unless I also add 1 to the other side of the equation. So that's how I keep the equation balanced. Now you'll notice that this right here is now a perfect square. That means it's actually factorable into x minus 2 times x minus 2, which I just write as x minus 2 squared. Then this is now a factorable quadratic or trinomial and factors into y plus 1 times y plus 1, which I write as y plus 1 squared. And then on the right side of the equation, I add those three numbers together and I get 4. And now you can see this is the form of the circle that we were working with yesterday. This is now the standard form of a circle. And so now I'm done with part A. I'm ready to move on to part B. I identify the center and the radius. So the center is at 2, -1, 2, -1. And the radius is going to be the square root of this. So the square root of 4, which is 2. So that's part B. Part C was to graph this, so I make a graph. The center was at 2, -1. So 2, -1 is right here. There's my center. And then a radius of 2 means from there I go out 2. So basically, there's my center at 2, -1, and then I move 2 units that way, 2 units that way, 2 units that way, 2 units that way. I go 2 units in every direction away from that center, and then I draw a circle through those 4 points, and there is my graph of this circle. All right, let's take a look at another example here. So basically exact same question, but a different equation here. So write the standard form of the equation, find the center and radius, and then graph. So here we go. first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to group my x's together and I'm going to group my y's together. And then you'll notice my value for C is already on the other side. However, my values for A are not 1. You can see here I've got a 4x squared and here I've got a 4y squared. I really want those to be 1s instead of 4s. So what do? I divide everything by 4. So I can divide everything on both sides of the equation by 4, and I'll get this. That divided by 4, 24 divided by 4 is 6, 4 divided by 4 is 1, and 16 divided by 4 is 4. I also have to divide negative 51 by 4, and that's not a nice whole number, unfortunately. So I've got to deal with negative 12.75. And then move C. It already is on the other side, so I'm done with that step. Then my third step is to add half of b squared to each side. So again, right here, I want this to be a perfect square, so half of negative 6 is negative 3, squared is 9. But I can't just add 9 right there unless I also add 9 to that side of the equation. Next, I have to do the same thing for y. Half of 4 is 2, 2 squared is 4, so I have to add a 4 there, so I have to add a 4 to the other side to keep it balanced. And now the reason I did that is because I now have made these both perfect squares. This is now factorable into x minus 3 times x minus 3, which is x minus 3 squared. This is factorable into x plus 2 times y plus 2 times y plus 2, which is y plus 2 squared. Notice this right here will always be that number that was half of b, and that will always be the case when you're doing this. And then I add, basically this is 13 plus negative 12.75 to get positive 0.25. And now my equation is in standard form, so that's the end of part A. Part B, identify the center and the radius. The center is at 3, negative 2. The radius is the square root of this. This is like the fraction 1/4, and the fraction 1/4, when you do the square root of that, you get 1/2. And you can even check that on your calculator. The square root of 0.25 is 0.5. So this is a circle centered at 3, negative 2 with a radius of 1/2. So you can see my grid here, I've scaled by 1/2, so I can make that radius how I want it. So the center is at 3, negative 2, and then my grid's counting by 1/2, so to move half a unit in each direction is only that much. And then I draw a circle through those 4 points, which I can't do very well without my circle tool because it's hard to draw on my computer using this tablet, but there you go. So there's my circle. So there's another example of starting in general form, converting to standard form, and graphing a circle. So when you're doing the homework, practice completing the square there. Make sure you are doing the same thing to both sides when you get to this step where you add half of b squared. And I think that's it for today. So of course, please send me any